Thank you. Okay, this is Adolf Hitler with Unity Mitford, and I'll come back to Unity and the Mitford sisters actually through this story. Just wanted to show it really at the beginning because that was Mosley's sister-in-law, and I actually think also people think Mosley's mistress, but she was part of Adolf Hitler's inner circle with Himmler, with Goebbels, and with Eva Braun, who wrote in the diaries how jealous Eva felt about Unity Mitford's closeness to Adolf Hitler. The Mitford sisters, there were, I think there was 6 sisters actually, but they were British aristocrats and socialites, and anti-Semites and supporters of Adolf Hitler. And in fact, there is it's not a fantastic story, but there is a theory that Unity, who actually did profess a love for Adolf Hitler, bore Hitler a child that grew up in England. And Channel 4 made a documentary about this. But in October 36, Mosley married Unity's sister Diana Mitford of the Guinness dynasty, and his marriage ceremony took place in the house of Goebbels with Adolf Hitler as guest of honor. And in the 60s, when Mosley conducted, interviews with people like Dimbleby and Robin Day, he was denied that, all that anti-Semitism, it was. And Max Mosley used to say, well, my father wasn't really anti-Semitic. And he was always looking for a British version of fascism. And also that, I think, my contention is that is completely untrue. So I'm going to look at Mosley's journey from conservative, it was a conservative MP to begin with, all the way through to this would-be self-created fascist demagogue, and his decline and his impact on just one area of Manchester, really, which is the Jewish quarter, Cheetham, which I'll go into some detail about. Now, 10 years before, because there is a journey, 10 years before this photograph was taken, sorry about that, we're moving too fast here. He's actually a member of the Labour Party, Oswald Mosley, and he's in the Fabian Society. When the Fabian Society is still going, he's rubbing shoulders with other Fabians like H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, etc. And the Fabians, which is pertinent to this story, were and are a gradualist. They believed in a gradualist movement, slow movement to a kind of social democracy, a kind of socialism. And they took their name actually from a Roman general who was known as Fabius the Delayer, whose tactic, which was unusual for Roman generals, was to avoid engaging with the enemy, but to wear them down, and they'd run out of and test their supply lines. And it's how he got this name from the way he fought or didn't fight the Carthaginians. So that's a little bit of classical history there. But so he goes from being on, I suppose, the right of the Labour Party, to being a leader of a fascist party. And he does it in a very, very short time. And there is an explanation for that. But first, a little bit about the era we're moving to talk about, or that he's occupying, because it's very easy to judge, isn't it? It's the obvious way we cannot help but judge history from hindsight, from where we are. And of course, fascism didn't have the connotations that it obviously has today. So the generation that joined the Black Shirts in the early 30s or fought them were adolescents during the First World War. when they were growing up, there was an Easter Rising in Dublin, the Russian Revolution, a civil war in Russia between the Red and White armies, the creation of an Irish Republic in Britain's oldest colony. It's, the nearest colony as well. An attempted revolution, the Spartacus revolt in Germany. The first Labour government. And this thing, there hasn't been universal suffrage for adults for that long. In 1924, the general strike in 26. Then there's the Wall Street crash in 1929. 1 in 3 adults are unemployed in Salford. And there's a rise of fashion. This is a period of political instability and of mass politics before TV, radio, etc. And had we lived through it, who knows? We may have been on either side of the political clashes. So it's easy for us to ask, how could they believe that? How could they get involved in that from the times we live in? But we have to see it through their eyes, or try to. And these are the kind of events. The chronology of the 30s, the Wall Street crash. Unemployment rises to over 2 million in Britain. The response to that is, we did have in the 80s during the Thatcher government, People's March for Jobs, the Right to Work march, but there is a national unemployed workers movement, and this is a mass organisation that organises hunger marches to London through the 30s. And it's set up actually and led by the Communist Party of Great Britain, which is very small, quite a small organisation there, but it has an influence well beyond its size. And it's interesting, really, because one of the things that, and I can understand that blaming, that many people think that it was the Labour Party that organises the hunger marches, and they're always talking about that, and they probably don't know, but they didn't really want anything to do with that movement. There was actually a women's hunger march from Tobenden, which I wanted to find out more. And apparently a guy who's written about this is Stuart McConey, who's written a fair bit about the hunger marches. So there is a minority Labour government with Ramsay MacDonald as PM, and I'll come on to talk a bit more about that, but it quickly becomes a national government, and he cannot hold the line inside the Labour Party. And that phrase from Yeats, the centre cannot hold, things fall apart, which he writes in the 1930s. And this is happening in Britain. Fascism has already arrived really in Italy. In 1922, Mussolini marches on Rome. These are times of we think we do live in troubled times now, but these are times where politics is fought on the streets, it's contested on the streets. Hitler tries to do a march on Rome with the beer hall putsch, but it doesn't work. We go into the mid-late 30s. Germans have marched into Rhineland, and some argue that it's really the beginning of the second. I don't think it is the beginning of the Second World War. It is what it is. It's the Spanish Civil War. People of Spain elect a Republican Popular Front government, and Franco isn't messing around with a second referendum. He takes the army, North African army, and there is a rebellion in Spain that lasts for 3 years. Stalin takes his grip in Russia, and then peoples will come where this story ends, go to fight in Spain. People are looking at the world internationally as well. Okay. Here he is. Yeah, you can see all this. He looks at this Oswald Mosley, a young Oswald Mosley. He was one of the youngest MPs before Bernadette Devlin, actually, in the history of the House of Commons. And he looks jolly spiffing, a kind of ripping yarns character. I can see, and in fact, what's his name? P.G. Wodehouse does write a book it's called The Code of the Worcesters in 1937, which is a sort of satire of the Blackshirts, and it's this character, Sir Roderick Spode, leader of the Black Shorts, who is an associate of Bertie Wooster. But Bertie Wooster, he walked, and people are walking around in the pages of the book going, "Heil Spode," and Bertie Wooster accuses Sir Roderick of disfiguring the London social scene by walking around in black shorts, which is because that's about as far as Bertie Wooster's anti-fascism goes. But it's quite telling, actually. Woodhouse is a serious writer, but you can see how he moves around. Mosley, he's elected as an independent as well, which isn't easy. Isn't easy now, wasn't easy then. And he has a short time in the Labour Party and a very short time in the New Party. It should say New Party, really, and then comes back when I'll go for it in more detail. Oswald Mosley is known obviously as a fascist. I read a biography by Stephen Dorrell, the historian, not the former health secretary, and the conclusion I draw is that Mosley was always first and foremost a Mosleyite. He wanted to be at the helm of England, really, or Britain, and whatever. And he also wanted to be at the helm of any party he was involved in, really. So yeah, the period. So this is on the left there, Oswald Harrington, leader of the National Unemployed Workers Movement, and there's a photograph of the Jarrow Crusade. So to bring it, and I've got a note here, the Battle of Bexley Square, to bring it to the particular locale I wanted to talk about. In October 1931 in Salford, the National Unemployed Workers Movement, and Well Harrington isn't there, but the branch of that, which meets in Hindman Hall on Liverpool Street, called for a demonstration in Salford against the means tests of 1931. And they don't know, I mean, Ewan McCall writes about it in his, very candidly in his autobiography, Journeyman. He's about 15, 16 at the time. And he goes around chalking walls, and he has this new little radical theatre group called the Red Megaphones, who perform on the back of a coal lorry. And they're never sure if anybody is going to turn up, but thousands of people turn up. And there is a battle, in Bexley Square, which is a small square, really, outside Salford Town Hall. And people, truncheons are drawn, horses are there. It's violent. Which they hadn't seen the like of. I get the impression they hadn't seen the like of before. And the following week, there's a demonstration over the same, a Manchester demonstration. There's always got to be a Salford. It's only a mile and a half away, but there's a Manchester demonstration. And the police instruct firemen to turn their fire hoses on the demonstrators. In Glasgow, the anti-means test demonstration results in Glaswegians pulling down the iron railings from a park and charging the police. Whatever it is that it comes out of governments from the Depression, people are not taking it lying down. And we have to think about the kind of conditions that people lived in at this time. So these quotes are from a survey of St Matthias Ward, which is a ward that the author Walter Greenwood becomes a Labour councillor for this ward. And Salford, as well as having really high unemployment, some of the worst housing in Britain. The tenant has concreted a large part of the cellar. This is still very damp. He also pays 1 shilling a week for disinfectant to put down the drains. The only tap is in the cellar. There is no sink. Wastewater has to be tipped into the street. The house is well kept by the tenant. And that's from Salford Women's Citizens Association. Now, the National Unemployed Workers Movement also, because it requires its information to around which it imposes demands, I suppose. And this is Eddie Frau, who was the former with Wilfred Frau of the founder rather of the Working Class Movement Library, was also writing reports at the same time about the same place. They found abject poverty. Furniture had been pawned and orange boxes filled the gaps. Food consisted of small quantities of tea, sugar, margarine, and a loaf of stale bread, mostly obtained on tick from the corner shop. In one group of 8 houses, they were told 14 adults and 23 children shared 2 closets, as water closets, as opposed to wardrobes. So Mosley begins to make his name really on a solution to the Depression. And he writes a memorandum, the Mosley Memorandum. In which he demands, really, he's calling for a national socialist. I don't think he uses the word fascist in it. It's a national socialist program. And he wants, I mean, it's Keynesian, massive amount of Keynesian before Keynes had really properly formulated his own ideas. And he's demanding massive state intervention, a series of direct works, crucially, the sidelining of Parliament. The talk, he wants to dispose of Parliament and the country to be run by an inner cabinet of around 6 MPs with, surprise, surprise, him at the helm. And he was opposed to free trade, puts Britain first. He continually, complains of cheap foreign labour, etc., etc. And he puts this to Ramsay MacDonald, and MacDonald dismisses it. He then goes to the Labour Party conference and puts it to the Labour Party conference. Now, he does attract, actually, people from who would call themselves, and we would call, from the left, and Ira Bevin, but also a young Harold Macmillan is very interested. But it's also, Harold Macmillan also goes to Spain to support, not to fight, but sympathetically to the International Brigade. People are, are vacillating around for all kinds of ideas. What happens is he doesn't get anywhere in the Labour Party with his ideas. And he was, at that time, actually seen as a possible Labour leader. So he resigns and he forms the new party in 1931. And people are already beginning to see Mosley as a kind of British pseudo Mussolini / Hitler. In fact, the Daily Worker calls him the English Hitler. But in general, people see him modeling himself on the dictator in Italy and the would-be one in Germany. And crucially, although this is a small party, he's got 6 former Labour MPs, but he starts to create around the new party, as if he needs it, a group of, again, it does sound like a P.G. Wodehouse, the Biff Boys. They are kind of security, which he doesn't really need actually at this stage. It's led by England's rugby captain, Peter Howard. Now, at a very, very young age, the party within a year, he fights a by-election in Ashton-under-Lyne, and gets hammered. It just splits the Labour vote and allows the Tories to get in. And then it is a general election comes on them very, very quickly, and they get nowhere. I think only in a couple of constituencies do they get be on something like 4th place. They're getting 1 or 2%. It's raver monster, monster raving loony party kind of results for them, which is, and this runs through, Mosley surrounds himself throughout his career with sycophants deliberately. He's insulated from the reality, the acid of reality, because everybody defers to him. And he's absolutely flabbergasted that he's not Prime Minister. So there was a launch of the new party in Manchester, and I'm going to try and play a recording of an interview I did over 30 years ago with someone called Benny Rothman, who this is a quote from, because Benny and a few others attend this meeting, this launch of the new party in Manchester. Now, I hope you can hear this.
To try to sort this problem out, and he was, very, very strangely, he was one of the national, he was on the executive committee, not involved at that stage.
Can you hear this, Nick?
An understanding of some of the international implications.
Were you involved in anti-fascist activity in the 30s?
Yeah. Yes, before I was married, I lived in Cheetham, in a Jewish area. And when Mosley, that's when you said, when I asked you, was it John Strachey? I can remember John Strachey supporting Mosley in the very early days of Mosley, before he became an open fascist. And he spoke at a meeting at the Free Trade Hall. And I was always involved in the outdoor movement with rambling, cycling, camping and all that kind of thing. And we'd been out rambling that day, and a group of us came down to the Free Trade Hall, and I'd come right off the moors, as it were, in my rambling clothes and in my rambling boots, down to the Free Trade Hall. And when it was Lady Cynthia Mosley, I don't know if she was a lady in those days, she may have been, I don't know. I don't know if it was Sir Oswald Mosley, can't quite remember. But anyhow, Cynthia Mosley was speaking on the same platform as John Strachey. And we really heckled the buggers. We heckled them no end on some of the statements they were making, because Strachey and Mosley, even in those days, were talking as if they were still socialists. And we heckled them until they were virtually driven off the platform. Now, for the first time ever, at that meeting, there was police interference. We'd never known it before. Certainly not within my memory.
Everybody else is hearing, but I'm not hearing anything.
Before I was ever
I don't know what anybody else is.
Politics, but I was in from about 1928, 29 in political.
Sorry, Nick, you said? You can't hear anything?
I can hear it there, Michael. It's loud and clear.
Nick?
Yep, loud and clear to me.
Yeah, it's loud and clear here. Yeah.
Adrian said he can hear as well, so thank you, Adrian.
I think it.
Yeah,
Nick,
same here. Clear as day.
So,
Nick,
Nick,
can I just say, I think it might be to do with Nick's volume on his computer, if everybody else can hear it. Look, I'm going to play it to the end.
No,
but
we can't hear it.
What?
We can't hear it either.
Well, the thing is, the key thing is, can you see a slide?
A slide.
No,
What are you looking at?
you.
Anything else?
I've got your sorry. I can see your folder open. Lots of pictures.
Oh, hold on a minute. Hold on.
Yes.
Hold on a minute. What can you see now?
There's your slide.
The new party and the free.
Yeah, well, that is what Benny is saying.
Right.
That's the never known police interference at a public meeting. But as soon as the meeting was over, the police rushed in and tried to arrest one or two people and me being in rambling clothes, I was very conspicuous. They made a dive to try and get me. They failed, you know. The unfortunate police inspector fell over, and he didn't arrest me. But then years afterwards, I was speaking with Strachey on a platform when he was, you know, back again in the bosom of the Labour movement, and he said, "I'm sure I've met you before, son of Benny." He said, "Have I done?" I said, "Well, you may have done, if you've got a very good memory." He said, "Where was it?" So I said, "In the Free Trade Hall when you were on the platform with Cynthia Mosley." And he didn't take kindly to that at all.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Right, okay, all right. Hi, Irene.
Hi.
Now, so you might just think, well, that's an anecdote, but it's actually quite an instructive one. So John Strachey, as a character, is quite well known at the time, and he's actually was a prolific writer. And he was he's someone on the left, and we have to see that Mosley always claimed that he was shooting from the left. And in fact, Benito Mussolini was the leader of the Italian Socialist Party before he formed the Italian Fascist Party. And Strachey was really just on the outskirts of the Communist Party at that time. And one of the things that, because Mosley being someone who wanted the state to run Britain, with him, now we talk of him being, you know, a Mussolini stroke Hitler character, but the other possible kind of analogy is he's a Stalin character as well, possibly, because what other society it has a kind of state capitalist with the political opposition basically sat upon at that particular time is Soviet Union, is Russia, who Mosley sees and Strachey sees as not having experienced the Great Depression. Where was the economic catastrophe? Where was the unemployment queues in Russia? And actually, that is, you know, not the case, because they were there. They were just in labor camps, etc. But you could get away with that. But Benny, and let's talk a little bit about Benny, who's quite important to the story, was, I suppose, ahead of the game in that he sees correctly, really, that Mosley wants to be an English Hitler. And it was Benny Rothman, you may have heard, in fact, I think it's the 90th anniversary this April, and there will be an event to mark the anniversary of this. He was the guy that led the Kinder Scout mass trespass up in the Peak District. And there was this thing, because he says he turns up at Mosley's meeting at the Free Trade Hall dressed in his rambling gear. I think it's his idea of a perfect day to go out onto the Peak District with his friends, go and trespass on some grouse moor, have a picnic, come back down and break up a fascist meeting in the evening and escape the police. That's his idea of a good time. He was a remarkable man. I met him a few times. Born in Cheetham, 1911, from Jewish Romanian parents, very poor. Father died when he was only 12 and was only a market trader, and his mother carried on taking on that work. He didn't finish his education. He had to leave early so he could get ahead of the queue for jobs, and it was seen as a benefit. And he worked in a garage. There is a story about that. In that, I'll tell you what it is. He worked in this garage, and the best he ever did was to park cars. Now, he desperately, when the Spanish Civil War broke out, he wanted to go and fight in Spain, and he was too young to allow to fight. And then he said he would drive an ambulance. I can do that. He said, I'll drive an ambulance. And they said, right, okay. And he went to this, you know, it went further than that. He went to this meeting, all the rest of it, and they were going to get him his ticket for Paris and all the rest of it. And he said that, and they said to him, how long have you been driving? He says, well, the truth is, I can't really drive. I've never really, you know, I have moved a couple of cars from the forecourt, but I can't. And he was, you know, and driving an ambulance in Spain was not, I mean, you had to drive them at night, effectively, and it was just as dangerous as fighting. So he wasn't allowed to go. But I'll carry on later on because I'll tell you he did something else to contribute to Aid for Spain. But it was him that set up, he was the founder, one of the founder members of the British Workers' Sports Federation, which eventually became the Ramblers Association, we know it as, yeah. And so there on the left, this is him as a teenager. When he was 14, he cycled from Cheetham to Snowdonia and back in one day because he just wanted to look at Snowdon. And there he is on the right as a engineer at Metrovix. And can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Right. Well, he's here with a white shirt in the middle. Am I right, Tony? Tony knows who everybody is in 1930s photo. Would you say that's him? I think that's him. Mike Wilder.
Yeah.
Mike Wilder.
Yeah, that's Benny Rothman, because Benny actually admitted that himself, or actually says that himself in his booklet.
Right. Okay. That'll be where I got it. Well, anyway, so
you've got another Cheetham white. Sorry, I'll just interrupt very, very quickly. Yeah. Far right, the one that's got the brill creamed hair is what's he called? Klein, Judd Klein.
Oh, is that Judd Klein? Oh, well, I do mention the Klein family, yeah. So, yeah, no, look, a lot of the people in this photograph will be from the district of Cheetham. And a number of them will, in 5 or 6 years' time, will travel to Spain to fight for the Republic and not come back. And they would have been involved in the anti-Blackshirt activity. So, back to Oswald. Well, anyway, look, it's not going well for him. So he goes to Italy in the New Party. He gives up pretty much on the New Party. And he goes to Italy and with several associates, he doesn't go on his own, he has got people around him. And they arrive in Rome on the 2nd of January 1932, joined by the writer Christopher Hobhouse, who's already done a recce in Munich. And according to Mosley's biographer, the Italians treat Mosley with a degree of deference, and is invited to meet Mussolini at the Palazzo Venezia and invited to stand with him during a fascist parade. From there, he goes to Munich to study Nazism, but little is known about that trip. On his return, he forms the British Union of Fascists. And it is largely modelled, really, more on Mussolini's organisation than on the Nazi Party. Mussolini's organisation has a black shirt uniform, it has a squadisti, and Mosley has an I squad. And he actually takes, I'll show you in a moment, the symbol. One of the things that apparently in the discussion with Mosley and Mussolini tells Mosley that you should provoke opposition. Opposition is good for you and good for the movement for two reasons. One is it will make you strong. It's a sort of central fascist idea, war, conflict is good for you, good. It will toughen you up. The second thing is you will be able to get allies, because the more people throw stones at you or fight you on the streets, people will come and side with you. And there may be more people against you than for you, but provoke opposition. And this seems to resonate with Oswald. You notice the women in the can you see this? Can we all see this slide, by the way? I have to keep checking, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. The women giving the Nazi salute, fascist salute. Mosley's British Union of Fascists, it grows really quickly in its first 18 months. They have about 50,000 members. population-wise, that by today's demographics, that would be over 100,000 in the space of 18 months. And a quarter of their membership are women. And a lot of, and people might be surprised about this, but a lot of suffragettes, former suffragettes, are drawn to the fascist movement. And there's a women's section established in 1933 under his mother, Lady Maud Mosley, who is getting on a bit, but she adopted a motherly role on behalf of young women. And they, there was a degree that they needed to be protected from male black shirts. But there were two big ex-suffragettes, Mary Richardson and Anne Brock Griggs, Olga Shaw, who were responsible for the north and the south of the country. And they were trained in combat, self-defense or fighting, because what happened was that, as what I'll show you in a minute, that women, anti-Blackshirts, anti-fascists, had to be beaten up and thrown out of meetings, and they preferred it if they were done by female Blackshirts. This is Unity on Mosley's left here. And Unity was also a member of Hitler's Nazi party, as well as the Blackshirts. And Unity is quite extraordinary. It's a bit strange, really. She took to, because people like Benny Rothman kept coming to Mosley meetings and heckling and breaking up, him and his comrades or whatever. So what Unity did, single-handedly, apparently, she used to dress up in a garb and walk into a Labour Party or a Communist Party meeting on her own and start heckling and trying to disrupt the meeting. Pretty determined in her own way. Now, not all members of the BUF wore the uniform. Like Mussolini, like Mosley's uniform members acted as a paramilitary stewards, a fascist defence force. Initially around 300, they were paid £1 a week and lived a semi-military life. He sunk his fortune. He was a baronet of the aristocracy. He was baronet of Ancoats. I don't know if you know Ancoats in Manchester. It's like being the Duke of Mars Platin or something, but he meant something. He had an aristocratic pedigree, and he sunk his fortune into the BUF and acquired a college premises in Chelsea to accommodate 5,000 of his defence force. Mussolini had a squad history, so I can't pronounce any foreign languages. And Mosley had an I squad, and they were paid £3 a week. And they were the kind of SS, I suppose. They were in charge of the Blackshirts. So he starts off, this is the icon on the left, is a sort of pretty much a replica of Mussolini's symbol. The face is called F-A-S-C-E-S, fascis. He drops that and adopts the flash. One of the things about Mosley is he's always talking about it's going to be a British kind of fascism. It's going to be better than the continental crap. It's going to be a British fascism. He was even more, he was a kind of even fascistic about his fascism. It's going to be superior. And don't you worry about that. But actually everything he did was kind of a copy of what was going on in the continent. And his major problem is that people saw, quite correctly really, Mosley's ideas as quite alien and incorporated, most of all worryingly, from the Nazis in Germany. So the BUF in Manchester, and he starts off, Manchester is important for Mosley. And the north is important. So the family have connections in the city of Manchester, but also the textile industry is suffering badly during the Depression. It's really badly hit. And it's not just Manchester, it's places like Rochdale, Blackburn, Oldenbury, the textile towns, which had taken a real kicking. But he starts off really, how does he approach Manchester? Well, there's two huge, he loves the rally, the Nuremberg style rally. And he uses a place called Bellevue. Some people may know it. It was a dog track there. I lost plenty of money at Bellevue in my time in Manchester. And there was a thing called the King's Hall, which held about 7,000. It's huge. But you could also operate open air. And then there's a free trade hall, which you'll probably know, which actually has connections to the suffragettes. But then he would start it off with really small venues, and he's looking to recruit working class people in poor areas. And this woman here is Bessie Berry. She's I don't know, she's probably in her 20s there, yeah. She works in a bookshop, Colette's, near Manchester Cathedral at this time, and she's in. I don't know if she's in Hume branch of the Communist Party at this point, but she's an active anti-fascist. Mosley used to concentrate on the Irish because there were no Jews in Hume. He had meetings using the slogan "Get back to Ireland," but there was terrific resistance. The official line of the Labour Party was "Ignore them, they'll go away." We thought not. They give an impression of strength because we see coaches turning up, clerks and people like that. We knew for a fact they brought coaches from Lancashire and Yorkshire, plenty of money. Mosley came to speak at Hume Town Hall one night. He gave his speech and there was a lot of heckling. He retired to a club room. The crowd decided we weren't going to let him speak. It went on to 1:30 in the morning until somebody got him out the back door. This account here is from the man on the bottom right. It's called Maurice Levine. I went to a big fascist demonstration in the open at Bellevue. Mosley spoke from the stands where people used to view the firework displays in the winter time. I remember standing next to a fellow with a very pale face. He was a fascist, putting his hand out and salute every time Mosley said something. I could see he was working class bloke, and I asked him why he was a fascist. He was a miner from Gresford, which is in North Wales, and he firmly believed that Mosley had the interests of the working classes at heart. Mosley had spoken on Albert Croft at Mars Platin, and I went to that meeting too. There were young communists heckling, but there must have been a lot of people supporting Mosley. Mosley was a brilliant speaker who moulded his style on Mussolini rather than on Hitler. So the first big meeting, in the first rally really, is in Bellevue. And what happens is that the anti-fascists decide that they are not going, because it is a 7,000 seater thing, and they're not going to try and heckle him off the stage. The numbers are kind of too big. And so they do is they have a meeting in the other part of Manchester the same night at the same time, an anti-racist meeting. And Benny Rothman, being Benny Rothman, who at this point has joined the Communist Party in 1929, he told me. And he's not, he's kind of undisciplined, I suppose, in that respect. He has his own mind. And he decides, sod that, I'm going to go, and I'm going to give Mosley a piece of my mind. And so do some others. And what happens just before this is that a man is turfed out because they recognize him as a friend of Benny's. But he gives Benny a handful, massive, bag actually of anti-racist leaflets, anti-fascist leaflets. And Benny stuffed these in his jacket. So there came a rolling of drums and a blare of trumpets, and preceded by a small army of strong-armed stewards, and followed by another group of stewards with the drum and the trumpet. accompanied a rising to a crescendo, an accompaniment rising to a crescendo. Mosley bounded into the hall and onto the platform to a spot mounted with microphones, and of course decorated with a huge Union Jack. Sections of his supporters stood up and became hysterical in their clapping and cheering as Mosley, resplendent in his tailor-made black uniform, melodramatically raised his arm to call for silence. Gradually silence was restored and Mosley started to speak in a dramatic voice and manner. He had hardly started when an interruption came from a spot on the balcony opposite me. It was a woman's voice, which I recognised right away as belonging to Evelyn Taylor. I leaned over the rails and asked the Stockport boys to keep the stewards off me for as long as possible, and then stood up on my seat. I took the leaflets out from under my overalls and scattered them in a semicircle in front of me. All the time I was shouting for the stewards to keep their hands off Evelyn. That, of course, only lasted for a few seconds. Blackshirt stewards in the region were literally fighting to get their hands on me and their feet too. I was knocked to the ground where I curled up in a tight ball, protecting myself from blows and kicks. 2 or 3 stewards picked me up off the ground. They dragged me to the top of the stairs of the balcony and pitched me over. Now I've got a YouTube kind of footage, which is about that rally, but I'll play at the end of this time as I'm conscious of the time. But it was a risky business, and they threw him over. So if you think of raked seating in a theatre, you know, going up really high, or an auditorium, they threw him over the back, but fortunately he landed on another steward who was standing underneath. But people got hurt, you know, and part of this became the undoing of Mosley, the violence of people around him. And this is the top of the photograph. That's Evelyn Taylor on the left, then around that time, because that's her first husband, George Brown, who was killed in Spain. And Evelyn went on to marry Jack Jones, actually, which those of us my generation remember as also a Spanish veteran, but leader of the Transport and General Workers Union in the 70s. She became a magistrate, actually, Evelyn Taylor, and who was it called? Lord Hailsham. I don't know how he found out, but he tried to have her sacked as a magistrate because of her past. Can you believe it? Maurice Levine talks about Wilfie Winnock, who he said Wilfie recalled him. He was at a meeting in the King's Hall. This is the very same meeting. Holds about 7,000. He got up to ask a question, must have been provocative. You were immediately pounced upon. They carried truncheons. They'd haul you out of your seat. Then in the corridor, you ran a gauntlet. He was badly injured, and he was a boxer. Used to box at the YMCA. So going to the meetings was, you know, at that time was, you know, you were in for trouble. I mean, and on the streets, which I'll come on to, they carried, black shirts carried koshes, but they also carried knuckle dusters. So Manchester becomes, you know, and it's kind of becomes a daily thing. There's the big rallies, but also people who sold the Daily Worker, and I know what he used to say, it was on Oldham Street at the top. And that's where the black shirts, of course, had their own paper, and which was called Action. And they wanted to drive Daily Worker sellers off. You know, their two enemies were the Bolsheviks, as they saw people like Bessie, who becomes Bessie Wilde. She marries a chap called Sam Wilde. And she says here, this is a recording of an interview at Tameside. We'd shout the workers' only daily newspaper or the people's anti-fascist paper. We sold from 3 p.m. and we drove the fascist off who sold Action. There were times when 1,000 copies of the paper were sold on a Saturday in town. So there are kind of continual street fights. Then, so after King's Hall, there's a big meeting in Free Trade Hall. And after what happens to Benny and Evelyn and Wilf Winnock, people from Cheetham and elsewhere go along to the Free Trade Hall meeting and they sing the red flag and the Internationale in unison over Mosley's speech. And he has to give in. At the end, he just can't be heard. And he has to end his rally. And so it's a peaceful thing, really, because there's too many of them to be attacked. But they drown him out and he withdraws. And they've bus loaded, well, they hire him near enough a carriage of a train and bring up 200 from London. And Mosley gets very angry about this, and he makes a real target of Cheetham and what he considers the Jewish people of Manchester, and in particular of Evelyn Taylor, because he recognises her apparently from the Bellevue incident, that she's also singing the red flag. And he pursues her for a private prosecution, and she's fined £25 for disrupted his meeting, and she refused to pay, and she goes to jail. So he sets up a HQ in Manchester on the edge of Cheetham, the Jewish area, in 34, October 34. And this is the front door. They're all posing for a picture. Let's just go back to that, actually. And that's all. There are black shirts in Manchester. And this is highly, highly provocative and very, very deliberate. Because at that time, his politics, or the black shirts, become openly and overtly and proactively anti-Semitic. Hilda Crowley, who grew up it's on Northumberland Street, and she grew up on the street. On the day of the official opening, I went along to witness the event. It was obvious that quite a number of other people like me had come along to witness the event. Like me, they stood on the periphery watching the supporters as they strode up the drive and mounted a guard on either side of the steps while he performed the open ceremony. There was an air of disquietude, which is a lovely word actually for something quite sinister. And she wrote a little autobiography called Bagels with Babushka, which I read at the Working Class Movement Library, which is responsible actually for a lot of sources I refer to here. But you can still get that in lovely little booklet on Amazon. So Cheetham here, are you people looking at a slide of a map?
Yeah.
Okay. I looked at this map and I thought, I never knew there were so many rivers in Manchester. I can't really, I never seen anybody fishing, but anyway. So Cheetham that's Manchester city centre. And Cheetham is just heading north. It's, if you come out of Victoria Station and go behind the station, you're in it. And what kind of area is it? So it's densely populated, working class Jewish quarter in the mid-30s. People working what you call sweated labour. It's textiles, pressers, cabinet makers, cap makers, and waterproof garment makers. And actually, the ironic thing is the black shirts, and I might, if I get time, I'll show this film, they love wearing Macs. It might look tall in that, but they were probably keeping people in Cheetham in work. And it's a densely populated area. And a lot of the time, it's on the edge of the city, but it's economically on the edge. And this is Henry Suss, is another guy I interviewed at the same time as Benny, who's a Jewish activist in that area. He says, I started working in clothing in 31. I left school in 29 when I was 14, and I worked in a merchant shippers for about 18 months. It was a slum for 31. I felt sorry for my boss, who was paying me 10 shillings for a 48-hour week. I was the youngest of 9 kids, all in the clothing industry. I learned that you could always get a job because they were low paid. What's going on in the background nationally, just wanted to point this out, was something called the aliens debate. Because that area of Cheetham, a lot of, say, Benny's parents are from Romania, Henry Suss's family, I think, are Lithuanian. And they come from what is known as the Pale. The Pale was the area where Jewish people were allowed to live in the Russian Empire. And if they lived outside of it, they had to renounce their religion. And it's on the eastern fringes of the Soviet Empire, and there were pogroms under the Tsars, and between 1870 and 1914, over 6 million people flee what we call Eastern Europe, and many went to Western Europe and America, but up to 150,000 arrive in Britain. And in response, Britain passed a law restricting immigration known as the Aliens Act. And aliens is a weird word, but it was used to describe people like Benny's family. And so anti-Semitism is not confined, I would say. It's not confined to the Blackshirts. So Maurice Levine, we'll go back to. My parents came to England from Lithuania. My 2 other sisters and brother about 1895. On the day they arrived, my brother, who was about 5 years old, ran into the street to see something of this strange new neighbourhood. He saw a skinned rabbit hanging in a greengrocer's and ran home to tell his mothers that the people here eat cats. Oh, it's just a charming, he's that pamphlet from Cheetham to Cordova is wonderful. And again, I got that, the Working Class Living Library, but you can get that, I think, still. Now his family come from a place where they are physically attacked. And he talks about washing his father's back and seeing the scars that they were attacked. And then Maurice is brought up in Cheetham. And they suffer anti-Semitism there. And what happens that there are these kind of gangs of, unemployed non-Jewish youth or just, of school age, scuttlers. There's a whole book on this, actually, called Manchester Gangs or the Gangs of Manchester or something. No, that's a film, isn't it? The Gangs of New York. It's called the Manchester Gang. And they used to come down to Cheetham to fight Jews. And so what you have in this particular area, because there are, what are the reasons that this little area of Cheetham, it provides so many Manchester radicals. And I spoke to a woman who's wrote a wonderful PhD called Ros Livshin about Judaism and radical politics. And some say the connection is theological between Judaism and the ideas of people like Karl Marx and Hegel, etc. But I'm with Ros in that it's really a combination of people who suffer economically and who have met generation after generation anti-Semitism. So radical politics work for them, if you like. And there's a really lovely quote from a guy, Aubrey Lewis. I never adopted the attitude, it was there, and if I ever get the chance, I'm going to get out and get out of it, get rich, because that's not a solution. My concern was that the whole thing should be made right. And then Maurice, the Communist Party was in such marked contrast to the Labour Party at that time. You have the national government, the defection of MacDonald and others, and one was influenced by the Russian Revolution. And the problem for Labour was that they had to balance the books. It was a Ramsay MacDonald, a Labour-led national government. And it is a Labour government that's imposing the means test and presiding over cuts in dole money. You can barely live on it, of the poorest people. And Bessie is correct. The Labour Party's attitude towards the Blackshirts was ignore them, they'll go away. So this is a little map of the few square mile of Cheetham. And Ros went through the different organizations there were. So there's a clarion, and politics operates out of people's houses. Many of these Morris's and Benny's generation, their parents were in something called the Bund, which predates Communist Socialist Party. It's a kind of socialist party. It's a Jewish organization, and it's probably one of the biggest political parties in the world at this time. And so their parents, in a way, are literary people, politically educated, and have experienced anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, and their kids grow up as Jews, but speaking Yiddish rather than Hebrew. And they are drawn to various radical organizations in the interwar years. So and these are all operating out of houses in those few square miles. So there's a number of Clarion fellowships. Clarion was a club from a paper by Robert Blatchford. I haven't got time to go into it, but quite important. They have, there's an independent Labour Party, which was quite a big deal. There were 6 or 7 ILP MPs at this time. George Orwell was in the Independent Labour Party. There was one family, the Hellmans, who were kind of important in development of someone called Ewan McCall. You'll know as the author of Dirty Old Town, First Time Ever I Saw Your Face, the singer, songwriter, dramatist. And the Hellmans named all their kids after characters in Ibsen's plays. And it was where Ewan McCall first encountered drama and acting. And yeah. So anyway, this place, this quarter, BSP's British Socialist Party. This place has a radical culture, and the black shirts arrive. And in 1934, these are quotes from Mosley's various meetings. They used to walk through Cheetham, and their chant was, the Yids, we're going to get rid of the Yids. And I'll tell you something about Eunice Mitford. There was a friend of hers that went with her to Nuremberg rallies and all the rest of it, and she kept a diary. Rebecca McIndoe, I think her name is. And I don't know if you've seen the film Brighton Rock or read the book, but there's this end of peer thing that you could do in the 30s where you spoke into a gramophone and it made a kind of record of whatever you said, didn't it? And it appears, it's key to the plot in Graham Greene's Brighton Rock. And Unity Mitford, this is a bit of fun for her on a day out. She goes to the trouble, I don't know, at Brighton or somewhere on the end of peer thing of doing this. And all she can think to shout into the gramophone. And this woman has been to the finest finishing schools that Switzerland has to offer. She starts yelling, the Yids, let's get rid of the Yids. And Lady Cynthia and Unity, when they'd entertain Oswald at the family home, they would, the sort of dinner joke was, anybody misbehaves, we'll send them to Dachau. They knew damn well what was happening in Germany, and they approved. And there's something in Mackindo's diary of when she was in Berlin with the Mitfords, and Jewish people were being forced to clean the streets. And she went over and applauded and said, jolly good. That's what we should do in Britain. So they walked through, the streets of Cheetham, daubing synagogues with swastikas. And this is another woman from an activist family. It's a photograph from the 1920s. She's named Lily Klein, the Klein family. And Tony pointed out earlier, her brother Judd Klein, who was on the mass trespass. Lily's father, one time when they were walking through, was very elderly. I have seen a photograph of him. He was an Orthodox Jew, I think, and he just starts shouting back at the black shirts, and they arrest him. And Lily jumps on. She's 17 years old, and she jumps on the policeman's back, you know. But then they decide in Cheetham that they're going to get serious about this. The black shirts are selling their paper. They're preventing young Jews from going to various places. Like there's an ice rink, which was quite a substantial building, actually, quite a massive thing and very popular. And this is Morris, yeah. We tangled with them. They had boxers, Moran. He was heavily scarred. I got near him. He took a swipe at me. I took a swipe at him. They were provocative. They did it almost every night. A favourite cafe of theirs was on Walters on Great Ducey Street near Victoria Station. They would walk through strange ways along Bury New Road to Northumberland Street to provoke the Jewish population. And there would often be scuffles with strange ways inhabitants who were very sensitive to the menace of fascism in their midst. Now, there's an international context here because, you know, when you get to the mid-30s, Hitler is chancellor. But now I often wondered about this. But we're looking at it from the other side of the Holocaust. So it's different. But Bessie was saying here, you know, people imagine that the newspapers were full of anti-Hitler stuff. They weren't. Large numbers of people would defend Hitler. He had built an autobahn, they'd say. There wasn't an awareness. The Manchester Guardian was good. The Daily Mail wasn't good, actually. One of the most historic days in the latter day history of Europe, the Daily Mail said on Hitler becoming chancellor. This is the Daily Mail, famous headline, "Hurrah for the Black Shirts." Viscount Rothermere, through his way, he associated newspapers, had a lot of newspapers, actually, in England and in Scotland. Mosley didn't need his money, but he kind of found the press helpful. The amount of fighting in the Cheetham area became a concern for Greater Manchester Police. There were routinely 4 or 5 incidents of public disorder every week, mainly in the Cheetham area. And Manchester becomes the first local authority or the first city in Britain to officially ban the wearing of political uniforms at public meetings. It's getting out of control. And what happens in 1935, a lot of the anti-fascist youth in Cheetham area formed something called the Challenge Club. Benny Rothman is founder member. And this, I don't know whether this is from my cursor to that white car at the end, is the extent of Herbert Street. That building looks kind of post-war, but it may have been rebuilt. But that side of the street is just workshops. So that's kind of, I think, where it is. And that side is housing and has been for a long time. And what the Challenge Club did, it was a social club. In fact, the Communist Party were annoyed with them. There are reports that it was too social and not political because they had a band, they had dances, as well as lectures and stuff. But also they trained people to speak on soapboxes. As I go back to, it was politics of the street in the 1930s. And the Communist Party at this time, well, it's not actually the Communist Party. The key thing is it's something called the Young Communist League, the YCLs I've put there, which to some extent in my head is still a bit of a mystery. You couldn't join until you were 16. But I found members of people who were in the YCL when they were nearly 30. There wasn't an automatic progression to the Communist Party, and it was mainly the young and that led the struggle against the black shirts in Cheetham. This is Francis Dean I interviewed at the same time. There were open air meetings in Platt Fields at the outbreak of the war. There was a tradition of regular pitches, Platt Fields, Alexander Park, and particularly Stevenson Square. and there's a great Chinese restaurant in Stevenson Square last time I was there, actually. But anyway, so it was a culture at that time of street meetings and streets, and they trained one another in that. And this is a bit long, really, because we're running out of time here. But there was a periphery. The YCL, that branch, was probably around 100 in the 30s, but the number of members of the Challenge Club were 200 to 400. So they had formed a periphery and people come because they get the confidence because something practical is being organised. There they are. Well, I did think about changing this from members of Cheetham Young Communists to members of Cheetham Challenge Club, because I'm not sure. But the Challenge was the YCL's weekly paper. And I actually found out I found out, Lindsay Cole from the Working Class Movement Library found it out, because we honed in on this photograph to get the exact week this was taken. That, again, if you see it in my cursor, second from the right is Benny Rothman. And Tony will be able to identify just about everybody in this photograph. Again, a number of these, it said food ship for Spain. It's the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. And a number of these people, after Mosley's defeated, they volunteer for Spain and they don't come back. I lost it. Last two slides and we're done. So what happens to Mosley? Well, the amount of violence that his stewards mete out, particularly at Olympia, actually, an event in London, caused great concern with MI5 and with the police. The other thing is that what is the electoral success of the Blackshirts? They get a councillor somewhere in Suffolk and somewhere else in Oxfordshire, like Chalfont and Giles. Actually, in industrial areas, they get nowhere. They get beaten back. The police start to take action. In 1937, they pass the Public Order Act. And after the Munich Agreement and Hitler having carte blanche to invade Czechoslovakia, the tide is turning robustly anti-fascist in Britain. However, I do want to say that I read about a meeting, I think it was the meeting prior, just 2 months in the July of 1939, where he enters into this absolutely vile anti-Semitic tirade and talks about making a deal with Hitler. And he gets a standing ovation of fascist salutes and cheers from thousands that last 15 minutes. He wasn't an isolated figure. He had a well to draw upon, but it was contested. And these are the people that contested it, I suppose. In 1940, MI5 agents uncover a correspondence between Mosley and a Scottish Unionist MP that, because what Mosley wanted was that when Hitler came to Britain, that he would put him as a kind of quisling, I suppose. And he's interned in Britain. Now, Unity, where it all began really, she so distressed about the thought of war between Britain and Germany, two countries she said she loved. She goes to an English garden in Munich and shoots herself in the head, but actually survives for a while. In Cheetham, when the Spanish Civil War breaks out, and before the International Brigades are even been formed, people queue up to go and fight for the Spanish Republic. And how do we explain? And it's, you've seen this little map, it's a small area. I can't think of many other places, maybe the East End in Stepney. South Wales miners, there were 100 South Wales miners who went to fight in Spain for the Republic. It's the biggest occupational group from Britain. But, you know, there were dozens, a couple of dozens pits in South Wales at that time. And I remember there were 11 something at the end of the miners' strike in 84. It's a quote from Giles Tremlett. Why, you know, why these kind of people? Their experience of historical bigotry and forthright anti-Semitism and fascism meant that the knowledge of oppression was greater than that of other working class people who travel with them and with deeper roots. And he's talking about Jewish people going to fight in Spain, because a disproportionate number of people who went for Britain were Jewish, a disproportionate number from practically every European country, and including America, who went to fight against Franco were Jewish. So much so that Yiddish was a lingua franca. I'm going to shut up there. Thank you all for listening. Mary, let's open it up if anybody's still here.
Yeah, no, thank you, Michael. That was just fantastic. So much information there. And I think next time I go into Manchester and Victoria Station, instead of turning into the centre of Manchester, I'm going to turn the other way. I'm going to go and have a look at these roads, because you've given us a map. That's what you've given us, with this different layer of history, and to understand that it was such a strong focus for Jewish radicals and the Young Communist Party, and the link to mass trespass and all these fantastic names of these individuals. I think it's just going to stay in us. So thank you so much. Anybody got any questions? If you want to unmute yourself, you can either use the chat, or you can put your hand up and I'll get to you.
That was fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. Tony Fox has very kindly put on, there is a Kinder Trespass. It's the 90th anniversary of that. It's an event that led, you know, Roy Hattersley became so much more radical after he resigned as Shadow Home Secretary. It said it was the most successful piece of direct action in British history. And I remember when I went to see Benny, and he was still, you know, like in his 80s, he was still campaigning for rights of access and for the countryside. Anyway, it's on the 23rd and 24th of April.
It's worth pointing out as well that Benny Rothman's actions led indirectly to the 1949 National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act.
Yeah.
And eventually to the Crow Act, Countryside and Rights of Way Act, and Right to Roam.
It was interesting how he saw and how they saw the countryside. So Ewan McCall, his friend and comrade, saw a spirit of freedom, they said. Because, you know, you work in these sort of really quite small workshops, long hours, 48 hours working, you know, weekends and bank holidays, getting out on the moors. And the Challenge Club organised, you know, group rambles for people. And, you know, families didn't have cars or anything like that. So they would get a train, I suppose, to Glossop, take it from there. But Benny was, at the time, was really, because so much of the moors was, you know, no-goes, confined because of grouse shooting and stuff like that. And he stayed with that all his life.
Yeah.
Michael,
yeah.
apart from you looking and doing all this research into Benny, has anybody written a biography of him?
There's a guy called Marcus. I can't remember his name. I just know him on Facebook as Marcus. Marcus, I got in touch. He got in touch with me. He's writing a biography of Benny. But the Working Class Movement Library, if you go onto their website, it has a page or so on Benny. And you know, the interview I conducted with him is there, and other interviews. Is Lindsay here from the library? don't want to hassle people when they're not at work, but
yes, I'm here.
well, there you go. Now, this is Lindsay Cole from wherever you are in Manchester, but Working Class Movement Library have a great deal on Benny. You could start on their website. I mean, when I went to see him, I was in my 20s, right? So, and I thought I was some kind of revolutionary, and Benny's in his 80s, and we were talking, we were talking about the 30s, but then I digress, he digress, another piece of cake and cup of tea arrives, and he says, I was on a trespass the other day. It was because Northwest Water, when the privatisation of the water authorities, and so a lot of reservoir land became off limits. And he says, I was up in the forest of Bowland with an anarchist group. There's a write-up here in this anarchist newspaper, and a guy's struggling to walk across the living room. He fought all his life, So I think, I don't know, we were talking about blue plaques before. Is there a blue plaque for somewhere for Benny, Lindsay?
Yes, there is in Tameside, I think.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, hi everyone. Can I ask a question about Benny Rothman for Mary or Michael? Did he have a brother who was a lawyer or in the legal professions? Do you know?
I don't know.
The reason I ask is because we've spoken a little bit about my grandfather was arrested at one of the. He was in the Challenge Club and he was arrested at one of the several of the demos. And in the Manchester Guardian, it's written in that I've forgotten the first name. I think it's Nathan Rothman, perhaps, or something like that. Defended the group and got them out with small fines, which they didn't pay. But I wondered if it was, because it was a Rothman, I wondered if it was the same Rothman clan, as it were. But I've got no way of knowing.
I don't know. Lindsay, do you know?
No, I don't know. I know his son, Harry Rothman, is still very involved in environmental issues, but I don't know about his siblings.
I know when he was on trial, the causing the disturbance on the mass trespass, he defended himself.
Benny did, didn't he? Yeah. He got, I think they got, they got locked up. I mean, he got 6 months. Did they get hard labour for that, Tony? I think they did. 6 months.
It was hard labour, yeah, because Judd Klein got 3 months.
Yeah.
And it was hard labour, yeah, but because almost instantly there was people protesting against it, it was rescinded.
One of the things about Benny, and it's revealing about the period, engineering, it was accepted. Maurice Levine wanted to be an engineer. Engineering was closed off for Jews, for Jewish young men. It was always closed off. It was closed off for all women, but it was closed off. But Benny becomes the exception. I suppose I do wonder if he did flag himself, because in the way that he said he could drive so well, he could go to drive an ambulance around Valencia or something. But he goes up. He ends up working at Metrovix in Trafford Park, and he wants to go to fight for Spain. He's the Communist Party, who really kind of manage it. So you're too important, and the same happens to someone there called Hugh Scanlon, who becomes the Hugh Scanlon, one of the most feared, or if you want that right word, trade unionists in Britain in the 70s. And so Benny and you, both sort of trained engineers, what they do during the Spanish Civil War is they make ambulance sidecars, yeah, that go on the side of a motorbike. You could take an injured person, yeah, and they make these sidecars from a workshop. And I never really asked. This is what Scanlon told me. Now, I never really asked at the time, was it in Cheetham? But I do wonder whether it was at the back of the Challenge Club, because I heard this weird story from Mike Luft that Benny Rothman tried to make an aircraft behind the Challenge Club in the 30s.
Brilliant.
I don't know if he was going to have a YCO Air Force or something, but this is apparently gospel. but that may be what happened. That's because the thing about Cheetham, Tony and I were talking, is that there's this self-contained area and it sends these people. It is probably the most prominent radical communist area in Manchester. And so people who are not from that particular area gravitate to it. So in the photograph of them standing there with the Challenge newspaper at the bottom, we think is Sam Wilde, who's not Jewish and he's from Ardwick, and becomes...
Can you put the picture back up, Mike?
What?
Put the picture back up.
Hold on. Can you see it?
Yeah.
So next to the man in the grey coat, the very dapper man, kind of conscious.
That's Izzy Love.
That's Izzy Love.
Yeah.
Wow.
Sorry.
I didn't know that. Well, I know I've met Mike and spoke to Mike a few times, and there's a quote about Izzy from Mike.
Michael, there's a question from somebody. Can I ask you? His name's Clayton Doyle, and he says, is it true that some of the Mitford sisters were socialist or communist? I thought the party was split left-right politically.
The family, you mean? Yeah, it may have been. It may have been.
The sisters.
Well, it's,
sorry, I apologize. Can I just step in? Sorry, Mike, I do apologize because I've already answered to him. One of them split off. All the rest of them were very right-wing, but you've got Jessica Mitford, who actually married Emily Romilly, Edmund Romilly, who wrote Bordillo.
Yeah.
Fought in the Spanish War as part of the Tom Manson Curia.
And cool. Edmund was he was Winston Churchill's nephew, wasn't he? Yeah. He was Winston Churchill's nephew, and there's a thing in Churchill's sort of notes or papers or autobiography that he tells Winston Churchill one morning while Churchill was already drinking heavily that he's decided he's a Bolshevik. His nephew, the Viscount of this, that, and the other, is a Bolshevik, and Churchill nearly enough falls over laughing at him. And then he goes off to Spain and fights for the international. He fights with Maurice Levine. Maurice Levine, in the tapes at the Working Class Movement Library, hung out with him. In fact, Sam Wilde talks about being in a trench with one of Churchill's nephews and said he was a really great soldier, actually. There you go. But the aristocracy, we've already seen that film Remains of the Day with Emma Thompson, Anthony Hopkins, about the British aristocracy were kind of all over the place. So Nancy Cunard, she's not in the aristocracy, but she's a very, very wealthy. Nancy Cunard becomes a communist and an appalling poet who writes this poem, we think about Sam Wilde, but other members of her family are with, sympathetic to fascism. They are, I don't know, they're interesting and confusing times.
Do you want to go back, because I don't think you actually explained that the guy hiding behind Izzy Luft is Sam Wilde.
Yeah.
And the two girls that are next to him is Lily Klein and Bella Klein.
Yeah.
Who is Judd Klein's brother. Oh, sorry, sisters. And Benny Rothman is the guy on the other side of Izzy Luft. Yeah.
I mean, they've all got their fists in it. They've all got their fists in the air, which I don't know if that necessarily makes them members of the YCL. Probably. Which one's Ralph Cantor? Is that Cantor up in the middle there?
Yes. Yeah, that's Ralph Cantor. Yeah.
There is.
Sorry, Mike. Just I know again. Very sorry. Apologies to everybody else, but me and Mike have been speaking about Judd Coleman, and Judd Coleman is the two guys on the left-hand side that hold the newspaper.
Yeah.
The second from the left is Judd Coleman.
Is he killed?
With a scarf. Judd Coleman, no. Ralph Cantor was killed.
Yeah, he's killed. Ralph Cantor he wrote a diary, more of a notebook, that it's amazing. I was privileged to hold a document at the Working Class Movement Library, but you really need to read it online. It's not online. It's on a file. It's digitized. It's quite really interesting because there's only one or two of them from British combatants. Yeah, I don't know. I think remarkable times make remarkable people, and we see that, we see that today in Ukraine and in other traumatic events around the world. You see the best of people and the worst of people, I suppose. But I came, I was studying really something other than this quarter of Manchester. And I was at the Working Class Movement Library, and I'd always wondered about this because I interviewed people in the sort of the 90s, and so many of them were Jewish. And I never really, there was this question at the back of my head, and it just stayed there. And I just went up to an archivist, Alan Kahn, and just said, why are all these radicals? Why they're all Jewish? And he goes, aha, come and have a cup of tea. And we began to talk about the relationship between communism, socialism, and Jewish people in Europe. And it's a really complex issue, I suppose. But I think the Jewish contribution, not just to anti-fascism, but to the development of the Labour movement in general in Britain and elsewhere in Europe, but in Britain, is enormous. And I don't know, when it was all that anti-Semitism sort of controversy in the Labour Party, I thought, and I was in the Labour Party at the time, I thought, the way to deal with this is just to run an educational session on, to look at the early Labour movement and how Jewish people built it and leave it at that. You know what I mean? Because and this little area, what I would say as well is, they go to Spain, and whilst this is a kind of possibly in some ways a tight-knit, possibly a bit of an insular community, their eyes are on the world. Yeah, they're reading, they're thinking, they're talking about what's going on elsewhere in the world, and they don't have the kind of money that Mosley and his entourage can go off to Paris and off to Nuremberg and all the rest of it, but they have in this, an internationalist perspective. And I'll talk about the neighbouring place, Salford, just over the river, and there was something in a place called Salford Workers' Arts Club, which was in this Hindman Hall when I talked about the Battle of Bexley Square. It was on Liverpool Street. And in the 30s, terrible unemployment and poverty, that bad housing I quoted, but at Hyman Hall, the National Unemployed Workers Movement and other radicals were running something very akin to the Challenge Club. And they were showing films. And, they probably showed a bit of Jimmy Cagney, but they were also showing films out of Weimar by Fritz Lang and modernist German cinema. They had a debating society. Irmakel's father, they would go down and, argue about Immanuel Kant versus Hegel versus John Stuart Mill versus, and they had lectures and all kinds of things. And it was a kind of the idea that if you were a radical, you had to be cultured. And they talked about the democratization of the arts rather than the dumbing down. And I can't remember, it might be Mick Jenkins' autobiography, The Place to Be Seen for a young radical, a young communist in the interwar years was the Halle. Go and see the Halle Orchestra. It wasn't Old Trafford or Main Road. It was, they saw themselves and that was part of, I think, the resistance to the misery of the Depression. A way of fighting back was to become an autodidact, to teach yourself and teach one another. So there was a resistance on the street, but there was a resistance of the intellect in the realm of ideas, which I find it very inspiring, I must say.
Right, thank you very much, Michael. That was just fantastic. I think you've answered everybody's questions. Thank you to Tony as well, because his knowledge is obviously fantastic.
Brilliant.
Yeah, thank you, Tony, and for all the links. And thank you to Lindsay as well for the links. And we'll follow them up, because I think we've only just started on this with our interest in this area of Cheetham. So thank you. We've got another History Society meeting on the 23rd of March at 7 o'clock. Excuse me, I've just got to turn off my kettle. I had to put the kettle on. There. 23rd of March, 7 o'clock in the bowling club. It's Jennifer Brealey from the West Yorkshire Archive Service in Wakefield. She's coming to show exactly what everybody can access online with regard to archives, family history, Hepton Store history, wider history. And she's just she's an extraordinary professional, and I think we're very lucky to have her. So she's at 7 o'clock on the 23rd of March.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for turning up and taking an interest in asking questions.
One last thing.
Yeah.
I just realised, as is this organisation, I've only just realised my book, and I'm not plugged in my book.
Yeah, plug it.
No, I actually got a quote in there from the Hepton Soul organisation about George Short, which I use quite a lot, and I do actually reference you when I do the presentations. So I do need to thank you for that. So I need to get you another copy from it or of it, but so that you can have it as your organisational copy. So thank you.
Well, maybe Tony, you can come and talk to us.
Yeah. I mean, I love the way you call us an organisation. It's
if you only knew. No, we are an organisation. We'll take that.
Yeah, we'll take. Yeah. All right. Take care, guys.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.